All right, so you started to get the understanding of color correction. You know exposure, white balance, skin tones, scopes, etc. But now we need to talk about which tool would you use to change those things if you need to adjust them. You have color boards, color wheels, curves, hue saturation curves, all that there. Well, in today's video, we're going to go over each one in detail, why you'd want to use one over the other, and which ones are good for which particular situations. Let's get into it. Now, to be fair, all these different tools tend to do the same thing, just in a slightly different way. They all either affect the actual colors in the image, the saturation / intensity of those colors, and the exposure of the image. There's just different ways to change that here. Let's jump into Final Cut Pro and take a look at each single one and why we'd want to use one over the other. All right, the first thing we need to address here is the color board. Now, the color board is from an older version of Final Cut Pro before it was updated to get wheels and curves, which are far more useful and more granular. However, if you're used to the color board, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a simpler tool to use here. You just can't get that granular. All right, so let's jump into Final Cut Pro here real quick and take a look at the color board. So, as I mentioned, we have 3 tabs here: exposure, saturation, and color. They all kind of work the same, where they have this global slider on the left here, and then you're gonna have 3 other adjustments here for your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So on the exposure tab, if I use the global slider here, I can move everything up all the way up to pure white, all the way down to perfect blacks there. And then for this image here, if I was gonna do like your standard S curve to show contrast, I'd pull the shadows down to about 0. These highlights are already kind of hot there, probably because of some of the whites in the car, but we could pull those up a little bit. And the midtones here probably need to come down a bit there, and that's for exposure. Then you'd come in, and if you needed to add some saturation there, you could add overall saturation to the image. If I went there, you could see it's too Oompa Loompa. If I went there, it's black and white. So you can just pump the saturation into the entire image, or if you wanted to, you could put saturation where you want to. And lastly here, we have the color tab, where we have a master slider here, shadows, midtones, and highlights there. So the master, if you wanted to add a tint over in the entire image, or let's say there was a tint in the image here, you could add it there. As you see, we're taking out, we could add some green there, or you could do it specifically in the shadows. So let's say you wanted to add some orange and teal there, and then if you wanted to add maybe some orange, you could do a nice little orange and teal look there. And we just went from that to that on the image using the color board. But as I mentioned before, most people don't use the color board anymore. They use the wheels and the curves. So let's jump into that, because those are the more important and the more granular things, and what you want to be using if you're taking advantage of all the new stuff in Final Cut Pro. I just wanted to touch on the board because it is there and I didn't want to leave it out there. All right, so jumping into the color wheel, this is almost always my default. I always start with these to adjust the exposure and maybe the saturation and maybe some color tints in the image here. By the way, quick pro tip, in Final Cut Pro, if you come into preferences here, you can choose which color correction tool you have as your default. So every time that you come in, by default, Final Cut Pro has it set to color board, which is the older version there. But I know that I start with my color wheels all the time there. So I start with the color wheels. Maybe by the end of this video, you have a good idea of all the different color tools there, and you could choose your default there. Anyway, jumping back into the color wheel. So we have 4 wheels here. You have your global, your shadows, your highlights, and your midtones there. We have handles on each side here, one for exposure. So again, I could put the exposure all the way up or all the way down. And then one for saturation. Then as we mentioned there, this one is global, so that's affecting the entire image. And then we could do the same thing for the shadows, the highlights, and our midtones. So generally I will start here by making sure I balance out my exposure, add some contrast there, maybe add a touch bit of saturation into the image there. And then sometimes you can start to look at the image to see if you do have like a color cast here, like the scopes is showing me that this image is kind of blue there. So I might want to add in maybe a little bit of red just to balance things out there just to start. But I start with my primary corrections in the color wheels here. The other thing that the color wheels are really good for are for adding your final look to your image, I do find as well. If you want to add, like, again, if I wanted to add just a quick orange and teal, while I would do a couple more things, I can add maybe some teal into the shadows there, and you're going to see it cool up there. And then I'm going to add some orange into the highlights there. And just real quick there, we have gone from this on the image to that, and we've just added a look. So the color wheels are very, very, very useful. The other thing that you could do with your color tools there is that you are able to mask things out. So if I add you can either add a shape mask or a color mask. Usually what I'll do is add a color mask, and I will pick the skin tones there, and this is picking up maybe a little bit more than, but just real quick there, you can see mainly the skin tones, and then I'll be able to affect things inside and outside of that mask. So typically what I would do there is I would have added that orange and teal outside of the mask into the highlights, not affecting the skin tones, and then come back and work on the skin tones individually, because the skin tones are the most important things in your image. All right, so I've just reset the image real quick without the colors in it and just did the exposure there just to show you this as well. Down here below the actual wheels here, we also have a couple more things that we can adjust, which are great for making quick global adjustments to white balance and any color tints here. We have a temperature slider here, so if you didn't nail your white balance, as you can see, we can warm the image up there and cool it all the way down if we need to. And then same thing here, if there's a weird tint, we do have our ability to shift the tints there to make quick global adjustments to the image. Really useful and a lot more powerful than the color board. All right, next up on the list here is going to be our color curves. This one is going to be another real favorite, especially if you come from a photography background, because you probably are used to curves in Lightroom there. This one is even more granular than the color wheels there, and the different curves come out to be very, very useful once you get to know them. Now you're gonna have three curves. You're gonna have your luma, which affects all of your different light in the image there, and then you have your red, your green, and your blue curves there that you could use to fix different colors at different parts of the image there. Curves are going to give you a lot more control over how you affect the image, because you could plot different points on here, and whatever you affect beyond that won't affect beyond that point there. So for most people here, they'd come into the luma curve and they would do a standard S curve to put contrast into the image. So if I come in here and I pull, there we go. And then we could do this here, pump up my highlights there, and then you could see my midtones still are looking really dark there. So I'm gonna come there and push the midtones up there. The only issue with working with just these color curves is that there is no saturation to be added into the image there. So you're still gonna need one of the other tools if you wanna do a global saturation change there. And then on your red, green, and blue curves, these are amazing because you can, again, fix different parts of the image. This is great for color balance in the image as well in specific parts of the image there. So as you see here, if I make some plots on some lines here and I just want to affect the redness in the highlights, you see as I'm moving on the scopes here, it is only affecting the highlights on the image. Same thing for the greens and the blues. If I came in here and said, hey, I want to change the blues in just the shadows, and I lock that part of the image off, you could see we're mainly just changing now in the shadow areas of the image there. Next up, we have the hue/saturation curves, which is one of the most powerful tools in Final Cut Pro, particularly when it comes to color correction. And we have a bunch of them. We have hue versus hue, hue versus saturation, hue versus luma, etc., etc. So you do have three different ways that you could use these particular set of curves. You have the global slider here, which will change everything in the image. As you can see, it's affecting everything there. Or you could plot specific lines. So if you wanted to go into a specific area and lock it off there, if I'm doing that, that's just affecting where I am and not anything beyond it. And then lastly, you could use the picker. So typically what I would do here is do something like pick the skin and then start making different changes there. So let's go back to example and go through each individual one, and I can show you what they do, and then I can show you how we use it in a practical sense there to get things done. So the first one is hue versus hue. You can use that to change any colors in the image here. So let me come here. If I take the picker and let's just pick this canopy here from this wedding scene, and you could see it's going to give me this in the pink/magenta area there. If I wanted to change the color completely and change that color, as you can see, I can make it green there. It's also changing anything else in that color. So my wife's lipstick was in that color, so you can see her lips change to green, which is kind of weird there. Or if we change it to blue, same thing is happening there, and it's affecting all the colors in that range. Let me go here, let me pick this green here. We could change this green to something else on this woman's sari. And as you can see there, it's changing the trees and all the different colors. So that's hue versus hue. Hue versus saturation affects the intensity of an image there. So if I come back here, same thing. If I wanted to maybe make this a little bit desaturated there, it would desaturate all the colors in that range there. And again, as you can see, my wife's lipstick is being changed there. Same thing. Let me do it for the greens just to show you, and it's going to change the trees a lot, which is something we could do in this image to make it make everything else pop a little bit more there. But I'm going to pull all the color out of the green there. You see the trees are changing, and this dress right here is changing as well. Hue versus luma is kind of like it sounds there. It's going to affect the specific color, how bright it is there. So let's say if you wanted to pull up maybe the skin tones there, you want to make them really bright to pop. You can't go too crazy. Or if you made them too dark, you see it's going crazy there. So that's hue versus luma. And the way I would use that again is maybe if a color is too loud in the image, boom, let's pull down the brightness of that there so that we could highlight the brightness of the skin tones or something like that. Then in here we have luma versus saturation, which is used to change the saturation of the shadows, mids, or highlights here. So your curve is plotted from here to here, and I typically use this to make sure after I've added a look to make sure that I have true blacks and true whites. So I'd come in here and maybe pull all the saturation out there of a color just to make sure that if I push too much color into a particular image there, I can at least get some true blacks into the shadows there and make sure that it affects that in that particular way there. Then we also have one for saturation versus saturation here. This one even confuses me a little bit here, but what you can do here is that you would pick the most saturated parts of an image plotted on the line there for your highlights and stuff there. So if I come here and pick, let's say this right here, that is a saturation line there, and what it's going to say here is anything that is not just the color, but anything that's in that range of saturation, you could pull it down there. So again, that one sounds a little bit confusing there, but when you're trying to really dial in looks there and you're saying, hey, this level of saturation for this particular part of the image, let's say in the highlights here, I'm going to desaturate the highlights there versus, and everything that's at that intensity is going to come down there. And then lastly, we have orange versus saturation here, which is particularly good for the skin tones. Typically, by the way, you can change it from orange to another color if you do need to there. So you could go, let's see, now we say yellow, lime, green, cyan versus saturation there. However, I personally think it's best to do orange versus saturation, and same thing there if you are changing the mid-tones there, the saturation of the skin tones, and anything that's orange. There's a lot of orange in this scene there, but you might want to dial in specifically where you want to change the orange versus the saturation on an image there for your skin tones there. All right, hopefully now you have a better understanding of all the different color tools in Final Cut Pro and how they work. Now the next thing we're going to do is go through an actual example of my color workflow, how I create images like the one that you see on the screen here with the orange and teal look, as well as some other images that we see here. If you want to see that process, click on the next video right here and I will see you over on that side. Big up yourself. Peace.